Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fought for Britain in World Wars I and II, but today the British military is struggling to recruit them. Why don't British Muslims want to serve? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. They have been referred to on occasions as the forgotten soldiers. Muslims were among millions from Britain's colonies who fought for the empire. But there are those who believe their contributions are not recognised and rarely shared as part of history. Has the past created a legacy of resentment today towards the British military?
It's one of Britain's oldest institutions, and for many, it's the ultimate sacrifice to serve Queen and country. But the British military has a massive problem: recruiting British Muslims. But why are they struggling to attract so few from the minority group? Over 400,000 Muslims from India fought for Britain in the First World War. Tens of thousands are thought to have died. In northern France, a monument has been created to remember some of those that died fighting for the Allies in World War I. Inside the Ring of Remembrance, 500 sheets of bronze stainless steel list 579,606 names.
Among the over 500,000 names mentioned here, there are Muslim names. Muslims that served for the British military and died in northern France. These men were thousands of miles away from their homes in what was then India. Some feel that their history is neglected, but that if it is taught, it could encourage British Muslims to join the military and also give them a stronger sense of identity.
The area aims to educate people about those that lost their lives fighting in France. British Muslims have come here on a tour to learn about what organisers call forgotten heroes.
Heritage extraction, fighting for Britain. And
at the back of this cemetery, there's a section where Muslim soldiers were laid to rest.
Hundreds of thousands of Muslims served in the two world wars. 576 of them are buried in this cemetery in northern France. However, although Muslims were willing to fight for colonial powers back then, British Muslims haven't been so keen to join up and fight for Britain.
I just don't feel like there's a real cause to fight because you just don't know who you're fighting for.
Jannah Islam's family members served in both world wars.
It made me proud, being a British citizen, you want to feel that connection not only to your other heritages but to Britain as well.
Although Jannah feels a sense of pride, she does have some reservations about whether her relatives should have fought for Britain.
I feel like they shouldn't have, because at the end of the day their freedom was taken advantage of. They weren't given the rights. I feel like the British has taken advantage of so many armies around the world just because they were colonised.
And there is an issue. 650 Muslims currently serve in the British military. To put that in context, there are more British Muslims that have gone out to Syria to join Daesh than there are serving in the armed forces. Muslims make up 4.4% of the UK population, but only 0.5% of the military. Some Muslim organisations don't believe Muslims should be joining the British military.
You have to be very blind to the political situation that's happening in the UK as well as around the world to essentially be comfortable with joining the army at this present time. Some people would see that as not only we're trying to pledge allegiance to the state, but rather to the foreign policy itself. And that's something that a lot of Muslims would decry about.
But others have come out in support of the military. Afzal Amin was an officer that served in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Foreign policy is a great motivator to join because you can have a disproportionately positive effect on the lives of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people who are themselves Muslim in those countries by doing a very good job being a part of the armed forces who are deployed there. But who was helped by the work that's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan? Other Muslims. So the British Army is not a non-Muslim army or a Muslim army, and it's not like that. It's a British army.
With the British military on a PR offensive to try and attract Muslims to their ranks, and the sacrifices that Muslims made for Britain in the past gaining attention, could we see more signing up? Or will the legacy of more recent wars continue to deter them from joining?
I'm joined at the round table today by Joe Glenton, former British Army soldier. We have the Executive Director of the Muslim Experience in World War I, an organisation that seeks to promote the history of Muslims in the First World War. That's Hayyan Ayaz Bhaba. Also, the Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, and we'll hear about that in just a moment. We have former British Army officer Afzal Amin, also formerly chaired the Armed Forces Muslim Association, and Arzu Merali, co-founder of the Islamic Human Rights Commission and co-author of The Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the UK. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us here at Roundtable. Afzal, let me ask you first of all, having served as a British Army officer, you rose to the rank of captain, you were in there for, I think, for 11 years. Did you ever think of yourself as a Muslim soldier or just a soldier?
I started Sandhurst in January 2002, so straight after 9/11, and it turned out I was one of a handful of NATO personnel, certainly at officer level, who had studied the history of the Middle East and had spoke Arabic and a few other sort of South Asian languages. And my Muslim background brought a huge amount of very positive contribution to operations. So it was never the case.
But on the ground, I mean, that was when you were studying, that was when you were learning, and you were with other people who were training to be officers. But on the ground, were you treated as a Muslim or as a soldier?
I think because I stood out as someone who had a degree in the history of the Middle East and who spoke Arabic, that had a big impact on the work I was invited to come and see if I could do. And that Muslim background had a huge impact on that work. So positive impact. Okay. So for me, it never left my contribution that I was a Muslim and British. And it was particularly noticeable amongst American colleagues because they had an even bigger problem than we do with this kind of diversity in their armed forces.
You see, Joe, what I'm driving at here is you also served, and I'm wondering if, as Afzal says, after 9/11, there was a change in perception, not just from those who perhaps wanted to join the military, but from those who were already serving in the way that they viewed Muslim recruits.
Yeah, there could have been change. I joined in 2004, so that was already underway. But I mean, maybe our experiences are slightly different because you were an officer and I was a soldier. But certainly, prejudice was apparent in the units I served in, which would have made it difficult, I think, made it difficult for the soldiers who were Muslims, and would have made it difficult. Though, of course, when they were joining, they wouldn't know that. But I think you make a very interesting point there. And maybe that's part of the reason there has been such a drive recently to recruit Muslim soldiers in order to, in some sense, to make the army look liberal and get recruits through the door, but also to kind of weaponise them, in a sense, in the way that women were sometimes weaponised. Their role in Afghanistan was weaponised. In some sense, they were useful because they were women and they could approach women. And I wonder if there's something there that Muslims have a kind of, in the military, have a kind of utility for the army. Maybe it is, but is it?
I'll give you a quick example. In Kakrez, north of Kandahar, the Taliban were detonating about 90 IEDs a month. A US Special Forces group arrived there with 2 US Air Force nurses who started providing gynecological support to the local women who were members of the Taliban families, and it went down to 2 or 3 a month. So is that weaponization or is that delivering good peace operations?
No, we've got to bring in the other guests as well. So, Arzu, do you see a problem here, or do you think it's just a natural, as you've suggested, a natural result of the Muslims feeling like a persecuted minority? Or
I don't think it's necessarily a case of them feeling like a persecuted minority. I think, in your introduction, you were talking about this kind of forgotten history, and I think, in fact, probably quite a lot of Muslims don't know about that history as well. I think it's a kind of something that's been so sort of subsumed by this kind of aggressive culture of otherization that even Muslims themselves, born and brought up in this country for a couple of generations, don't know this history. They went to the same schools as everybody else, after all. I think we have a wider issue, and I think just to specifically address the question, why aren't Muslims, happy to be recruited, we need to ask Muslims. I don't know that there's been a kind of comprehensive survey by the army asking this question, so in a way we're all kind of guessing. But I think there is a kind of broader concern about the militarisation of British society per se, over particularly the last 10 years, but then maybe we can set it in a wider context of post 9/11. I think a lot of Muslims are caught up in that. They were very much as a community against the Iraq war, less so the Afghanistan war, but still generally anti-war. And I think the kind of consequences of that, of militarization, not just through the wars, but other policies, are playing on this.
Hayyan, because of your understanding of the history of this,
Yes.
Are we seeing something different these days with recruiting Muslims in particular? We'll talk about other ethnic minorities in just a moment, but are we seeing something that has changed in the last 20, 25 years?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer the question as to whether we've seen a change in recruitment of Muslims in the army in the last 25 years. But I would say that the difficulties I think that there are in terms of recruiting Muslims and other ethnic minorities, I think that the issues that affect them and concern them aren't properly understood. And maybe that's because the questions aren't being asked, and we're not asking Muslims why they may not find it appealing to join the army.
Because I'm looking back at the numbers, and we talked about, 500,000 in First World War and so on and so forth. A lot of those, and you made this point to me before we came on air, were Commonwealth soldiers or from colonies. They weren't necessarily British Muslims. And your suggestion,
my grandfather was one of them.
Your suggestion is that of the 600 and whatever we have in the military today, only a handful of those would be British Muslims. You think they've come from colonies or old colonies as well?
My 11-year experience, including a year and a half as the chairman of the Armed Forces Muslim Association, it's absolutely clear that the majority of the 650 people who are declared Muslims in Her Majesty's Armed Forces are not British. They're from the Commonwealth. And a very small number of British Muslims are in the armed forces.
So what do you make, Arzu, of this covenant where the mosques have said, look, this is something we would like to support. We would like to see more Muslims in the British military. It's a promise on paper, but is there anything practical about it?
I think, honestly, that operates in a completely different sphere of discussion than the one we're having now. And that's to do with, unfortunately, this culture of, as I mentioned, otherization of Muslims, which is resulting in a kind of socialization of Muslim civil society towards this overwhelming narrative that somehow Muslims have to show themselves to be, the perfect citizens. I mean, we're not asking synagogues, we're not asking Catholic churches, we're not asking for this kind of covenant, or we're not seeing it being sort of pushed into other religious communities. And you have to wonder, why is it that Muslims are kind of under this pressure to show this kind of loyalty? Why can't they just say, well, we're not interested in militarization or anything else? Why is it their business?
What do you make of a covenant like this, Jay?
I think the Armed Forces Covenant is a strange beast, and I kind of get, or the kind of newest iteration of it is a strange beast. My understanding is that kind of mid to late 2000s, the wars were going extremely badly, the wars were extremely unpopular, and a number of schemes came about, including one led by Gordon Brown, came about to try and mitigate some of that anti-war feeling by popularising the military. They couldn't popularise the war, so they tried to popularise the military. And a lot of the things which have emerged since then seem to buy into that.
Because one of the things they're saying is that joining up in the military shows you have loyalty to your country.
It is, but I also think there
damned if you don't, aren't you?
It's a funny one, because there are so many ways to be British, and I don't know why being in the military or hero worshipping the military is chief among them. It would be just as British. Dissent is British. The big anti-war marches were quintessentially British. Dissent among soldiers has a long, glorious history in this country. So I don't know why service in the military or a particular view of the military should be the chief value.
Well, it's quite obvious why.
Tell me.
I mean, the military have defended this country
in
for
Iraq,
hundreds of years.
In Afghanistan. Let's look at the modern. That's
look
nothing
about the
to do with
culture
defending Britain.
No, but look at the culture of the role of the military in our nation's collective psyche. And the First World War and the Second World War were existential threats to our country. And it was the military that stepped up, not the dissenters or the marchers in the street, that defended us from Nazi invasion. And during the Cold War, that's still the case, that Britain's role as a part of NATO, as leading forces against the Soviets, has kept this country safe.
I think we're
you can't dismiss that.
Oh, I think we're missing a trick here.
I want to bring Hayyan in. You can say what you want in a minute, if you don't mind. May I just bring him in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, because you were nodding at something that Joe was saying, and I didn't want to lose that train. What was that?
Well, I agree with Joe. I don't think that serving in the military is the only way one can show their loyalty or love for their country. I think, just being a good citizen can be doing the same. Being a policeman or working in the NHS or working in the civil service. I agree completely with Joe that it can be problematic and unhelpful and divisive to frame the conversation in that way.
And Arzu, you talk about you having a negative view of the military in general anyway. I mean, without, whether they be Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, Judaism, without a military, a country is defenceless.
Yeah, I'm not a pacifist, so I'm not against having a military. I just think the way that we have sort of developed almost covertly or by accident, or not accident, it's by design, but without the general public perhaps being so conscious of it, this kind of new state of militarization is deeply troubling. We haven't had a kind of critical conversation about it. I mean, it's interesting that you were mentioning that you said, there was an existential threat to Britain in the First World War. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was taught at school that the First World War was this kind of barbaric waste of young British lives, okay? I mean, that was the narrative, which is now kind of completely flipped, and we're talking about not this kind of useless war that was a slaughter. And I'm just going over stuff with my kids.
If you don't mind, that's for another day. Yeah. I think something like that. But I would like to get back to the main point of the discussion, which is the difficulty in particular in getting Muslims into the military. Well, not necessarily just Muslims, but getting ethnic minorities into the military. So you think the covenant should be stronger. I believe that you should actually have people who go and worship at a mosque being invited to go and see the military in action, whether they be cadets or whatever.
Well, I mean, there's quite a few things to unpack there. First of all, I think the desire to have Muslims and others who are not sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants join the armed forces is not driven by the army wanting to be liberal or anything sort of sinister. It's driven by operational need. And we have caused a huge amount of unnecessary suffering and damage in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've killed huge amounts of civilians. And much of that, I think, could have been avoided had there been more Muslims serving in the armed forces, interacting with those people and delivering a message of we're here to help you.
But can you recruit more Muslims to explain a flawed policy that has led to the deaths of people with whom they share the same religion?
But we're jumping from the sort of strategic level of the military to the geostrategic level of politics. And at the ministerial level, I agree with you. And Gordon Brown said the day he now feels they were misled by the Americans about the intelligence going into Iraq. But there's one important point I want to pick up on. That's this thing that my colleague here raised on otherization of the Muslims and feeling somehow that we're under pressure and so on. I don't feel otherized. I feel perfectly comfortable being Muslim and being British, and I've tried to raise my two children that way too. And we were raised that way in my own family. So I think that there's a wide diversity of experience of what it means to be British and to be Muslim, and how much one feels one can contribute to our society. And there are pressures, I agree, racism and Islamophobia and all that exists. But the overwhelming vast majority of British Muslims are fully integrated people living harmonious British lives in our country. And it's much to be celebrated there.
But I think, if I can just pick up
in a minute.
Look, poll after poll after poll, whether it's my organisation, whether it's Gallup, etc., show that Muslims feel highly British. They feel very loyal to the country, even in fact more so than the dominant community in this country, right? But the actual lived experience is highly negative. And, it's one thing to feel part of the country, but it's another thing to know that it's not reciprocated. And what we're actually seeing is a kind of collapse of that idea of reciprocity, of citizenship, okay? We're not being made to feel like citizens. It's not because there's something lacking on the Muslim side.
This is a government press release from 2014, and we all treat press releases whichever way we want to. And it's about the military. It says the number of Islamic recruits in the UK Armed Forces has risen by well over 40% since 2007. Bear in mind, this was 3 years ago. And the Religious Affairs Advisor, or the Islamic Religious Affairs Advisor to the military, said the increasing number of Muslims in the UK Armed Forces is a natural change because society is becoming more tolerant. I mean, when people read and hear that sort of thing, what are they actually going to think about the truth? What do you believe?
Well, I think I think the society is becoming more educated about Muslims, and that's because Muslims are doing better in society, and so they occupy more senior positions in business, in government, in leadership, etc. But that doesn't mean to say that the otherization of Muslims hasn't stopped. In fact, I'd say that it's increased. Muslims are very well aware of the coverage in the media about them and their identity and how they are treated differently. And I think that's very overwhelming. I don't think you can attribute the rise in Muslim recruits in the MOD.
But this is over a period that has now ended 3 years ago, yeah?
Yeah, no, I don't think you can attribute the rise of Muslim recruits in the MOD to being about Britain being more tolerant now. I think actually that what's happened over the last few years is the MOD has just been more engaged in actively recruiting people from all ethnic minority backgrounds.
And then we take a look at the numbers. Actually, I've turned the page over, maybe I haven't got it in front of me. But there are major problems recruiting from all sorts of different religions. What have we got? 870 Hindu, 560 Buddhist, 160 Sikh. I'm not sure I believe the 70 Jewish members of the British Armed Forces. I would imagine it's a bit higher than that. But it's a big picture. Or is it all about the British military itself rather than the ethnic minorities that they're not being able to recruit? I think it's Joe's thought.
There is a recruiting crisis at the moment. They're really struggling to get people through the doors. I think we particularly see that with the reserves, where they almost like in Afghanistan, where they had kind of ghost soldiers. Not quite as bad as that, but there are people signed up to the TA, for example, or the reserves as it now is, who just don't attend. So they've done lots of things to try and kind of cook that. They've started classifying what would have been untrained soldiers as soldiers and classifying them as being kind of on strength just to mitigate that. So there is that broader recruitment crisis in society, which I mean, I don't know what the reasons are, but it is interesting that it comes at a time when things economically are pretty tough, and normally recession is the recruiting sergeant, as they say.
Because
so
people need jobs.
I mean, I'd have to really go over the figures, but there clearly is a broader issue. But there may also well be particular issues around particular ethnic groups.
Sometimes at the end of these programmes, I wonder why we've talked about it. Not because I don't think it's been interesting, but because I sometimes think, actually, you know, what was the real reason we thought it was worth highlighting a particular issue? Now, I want each one of you to say why you think it's worth bringing this up and putting a spotlight on it. Arzu.
I'm not sure that it is, not because of the fact that there might or might not be a recruiting crisis in the army, but it seems to me to be just another one of those things where we problematise Muslims and we get distracted from bigger questions about the role of the military, about the type of society we've ended up in. If you stop talking about Muslims and maybe read the Quaker Witness Project report on militarisation, then you have a whole different set of questions maybe we need to be asking.
So what do you think you mean by otherisation? It's a word that's come up quite a few times here. Is it just simply integration, which would also be part of joining?
Integration is part of it, but the thing is, as I said, it's a two-way process. So we've got a situation where generation after generation of Muslims feel integrated. Earlier you mentioned something about those troops in the First World War being colonial troops. Well, actually, technically, they were British troops. Okay, that was their bit of paper if they had a passport, right? But we're still talking about them as something different. Actually, we should be saying, there were that many million British troops. This is me with a different hat where I would normally be very critical about colonialism. But, that's the technical reality. So if we're not even able to accept that, we're still stuck.
But the same question to you, Afzal. Is this something that we're looking at because we look at everything to do with this particular issue, perhaps too closely, or is it something that is worth examining?
It's absolutely worth examining and discussing, and we should have a proper conference, I think, and bring in experts to discuss these things and look at some of the data and how that data was compiled. There's a huge history of the last 15 years of the contribution British Muslims have made to the collective security of NATO countries, particularly from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the ongoing operations that are going on in the Middle East. That's not going to change for the next 50 years. So an investment in British Muslims and their contribution to our collective security, I think, is one well worth making.
Yeah, which is when we come back to you and the historical context of all of this. Give us an idea.
Well, in the project that I'm running, we've discovered that 2.5 million Muslim soldiers from around the world fought for the Allies, and these were colonial troops. This includes the contingent of the British Indian Army Muslim soldiers. And we think it's important to highlight this because, as we've highlighted today, there are issues about and discussions about the place of Muslims in Britain and in Europe, the otherisation, integration, identity. And there's, of course, those growing radical movements that want to hate on Muslims. So I think it's very important to highlight this to show that Muslims have always been a part of the fabric of the life of Europe, and as Afzal's rightly said, contributed to the security of this country and Europe. But I completely agree with Arzu that I think this conversation is sometimes not helpful, but again, it's an opportunity for us to have this conversation and to maybe assess all of these reasons, these push and pull factors that when it comes to recruitment, because I still believe that Muslims are misunderstood, and I don't believe there has been any real, genuine exercise been done by anybody to understand these issues. And sometimes I think it can be just common sense reasons.
And Joe, if you wouldn't mind sort of helping us sort of pull this all together, what do you think the British military should do about this, or is it just something you've got to live with?
I think it will be very difficult to turn this around, I think, as Afzal just pointed out, while we are operating in the Middle East in the way we do, and that's not going to change. Yeah, it's difficult to say. And I suppose if there is a section of society who don't want to do a particular thing, you have to ask why. And I think one of the reasons, maybe not the fundamental reason, but a reason why lots of British Muslims would pull back from joining the military is because of foreign policy over the last 15 years. We're not talking about we're not talking about the First World War and the Second World War. We're talking about these wars.
We're talking about today.
And those wars, of course, there was conscription.
Yeah.
This is a voluntary army, and I think that's a different dynamic.
Change policy. Listen, thank you.
There wasn't conscription in the
I've got to
British
stop you. We can carry on this conversation outside. Thank you very, very much indeed. I think one of the things that we've agreed on here is that black, white, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, the colour of blood is just the same, whoever you are. Thanks for watching. I'm David Foster, the Roundtable team. See you next time, I hope.